Hi there, and welcome to Intangify, the Intangify podcast, where we talk about intangible aspects of business. I'm your host, Matthew Asbell. By day, I'm an intellectual property attorney, but this is a window into things beyond what I do from day to day and beyond what my guests do from day to day. But my guest today is John Maggiore. And John is a commissioner for the Public Service Commission in New York State. But he has a kind of an interesting side project. And we thought we would talk a little bit about that in the context of the intangible of passion. Because I think you can't really do anything well without that kind of passion. I know I have that in my day-to-day in my career. John, I know you have it in yours, but let's talk about your many passions.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show.
My pleasure. It was actually pretty interesting to me the first time I spoke with you to learn that you hadn't been interviewed. You have often been on the other side of the camera or the microphone. Tell me what it is that you were doing.
So we talked in the context of Maggiore on Bowie, which began as a blog and continues as a blog that I update every day. But about 2 years ago, the very beginning of 2024, also took on an element of being a YouTube interview show where I have posted a new interview every week that has some connection to David Bowie. Sometimes a very direct connection. I've interviewed many of his musical collaborators and other people that work with David Bowie, and some of those connections are more tangential. So a recent interview that I had was with the physicist Lawrence Krauss, talking about the concept of nothing. And the connection to Bowie is, it's a word that appears very frequently in Bowie's lyrics, and it comes up in discussion over and over and over again. And Lawrence Krauss wrote a book, A Universe from Nothing, and it gives a famous lecture on the concept of how within theoretical particle physics, something can come from nothing. Like, that's a guy I want to talk to, and I'm going to connect him to David Bowie. The show is on YouTube, and the blog is www.maggioreonbowie.com, where I have new content every single day that almost always has something to do with David Bowie. And it's interesting because when you commit to doing a daily blog post, you have to be creative into how to keep that material fresh, what the connections are that are relevant. You know, I've started seeing the world through a David Bowie lens, which you didn't think you could do, but I'm telling you, you can. So that's in the broadest possible way I could describe it. That's the project. And it's been going strong. The blog started in 2018, and it was a spinoff of a project that I came up with on the spur of a moment on Facebook that started in 2016, the day David Bowie died. I think it's going to be going stronger into the future.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, let's start with the inspiration behind it, because, why are you talking about David Bowie? Where did that come from?
So I've been a David Bowie fan since the 80s. I think the first rock concert I ever went to was a Bowie show in Toronto in 1987. I was such a fan of David Bowie that, he provided, I would say that his is the only human voice I've listened to every day for the past 40 years, which is a slight exaggeration, but almost true. And the day that he died was shortly after he had come out with a new album called Black Star, which turned out to be his last album. And I was doing the ritual of whenever he came out with the new album, I would listen to it over and over and over again. And one morning I came downstairs, I opened up my iPad, and I had a notice that he had died, which I was not expecting. And on the spur of the moment, I decided that I would post the name of a Bowie song on Facebook every day for a year as a tribute. And I posted the first one I posted is called Absolute Beginners for obvious reasons. And a friend of mine responded, why don't you write something about the song rather than just the name of the song? So I started doing that. And on Facebook, these posts developed a following of hundreds of people, including one of Bowie's key collaborators, who I'm not going to mention because he hasn't come on my show as a guest yet. and I want to get him. It was developing a following and people were looking forward to it. And the year came to an end. And a friend of mine who does blog design, or does web design, I should say, created the bones of a blog as a gift without me asking for it. And he said, you should still keep writing about David Bowie. So I picked that up as an occasional project as a fan. And at this time, I was in a very intense job in government that had absolutely nothing to do with David Bowie. And I would write blog entries once in a while for nobody. I did nothing to try to draw attention to the blog, but it gave me something to think about, something to apply the thought process to that I was passionate about, but had nothing to do with work. So it allowed me to think about something other than work. But at that time, I could make only the occasional blog post, and I wasn't really thinking about any kind of an audience. During the lockdown, during the darkest days of the pandemic, I actually went on medical leave at one point and decided to shift and write a daily blog post as a mental health exercise. And I could have done this on politics or government because that's where my professional life is. But part of the mental health exercise would be about writing about something other than that. And so my options were either to basically journal an exploration of something that I was interested in but had no expertise in, or David Bowie was the one other thing that I had a leg to stand on to write about, just because of what I had been doing for the previous couple of years. And once you make a commitment to do something daily, it's like you're self-educating yourself, you're teaching yourself. I'm not sure which year I started doing it daily. Let's say it was 2021. By late 2023, somebody had noticed a post that I did nothing to advertise that mentioned a project that he had worked on, which was called a mashup. It was a mashup of a David Bowie song and a Talking Heads song. We had a back and forth. This person, whose name he goes by Dom, D-O-M. He's a French mashup artist. And this turned into my first interview, which was a written interview. And I was just blown away by the concept that some guy in France was reading what I wrote. So I started shooting off email invitations to others who I had either mentioned in my blog or that I had read to interview them in this way. And I conducted a few written interviews before I sent in a request to a famous philosophy professor and philosopher and author named Simon Critchley. And he agreed to participate in an interview, but only if we did it by YouTube, because it hadn't occurred to me that asking somebody to do a written interview is actually a much, much bigger commitment. I had to learn how to establish a YouTube show. I needed to learn how to record it. I needed to do a crash course in Simon Critchley because he's authored, dozens of books, and he's a figure in, if you want a philosopher to come on your podcast, Simon Critchley is the guy. So he's like a real guy. And I needed to really understand who it was I was going to talk to. So this became like a little mini project. And all of that, right? So you start with David Bowie and you learn how to do a YouTube show. You learn about this internationally well-known and respected philosopher. All of this was just in preparation for one show. And it became, I just started firing off these invitations, and I've been able to do one per week ever since. And I've had some really fascinating guests. So part of what I'm chronicling is what I'm learning. But I also think that I had a leg to stand on from, years as being a fan, casually reading books about David Bowie. When I started this, I wasn't an expert, and I don't know that I'm an expert now, but I know enough to have the conversation.
You got inspired largely, from his death and sort of a tribute. And it sounds like this has been a project really about relaxing and removing yourself from your day-to-day grind so that you would have something else and a different way to use your brain which gravitated from being occasional to being daily.
I wouldn't call it relaxing. I think it's a different avenue to channel my energies, but it's consuming in a good way. It's engaging in a very energetic way. And it's a funny thing because it's a hobby, right? It's not something that I make money off of. But because there is now an audience, there are deadlines and expectations, not because they come from the rules of a job, but just because of, it's developed a cosmology of its own. If I miss a week, I don't know what the reaction is going to be. So I feel compelled to have a backlog of interviews, and there's a prep for all those interviews, and I'm learning how to edit them better. I'm learning, how to make them more visually interesting on YouTube. So there's a momentum that is engaging. It's fascinating, but I don't know that relaxing is the right word.
That's fair. I think it's interesting because if any of one of my audience members, for instance, if they were listening to this and they were thinking about, I would really like to do a blog or a YouTube channel or a podcast or anything of that nature. Usually it starts from like the objective and the goal. Like, why am I doing this? What it is that I'm trying to do? And then formulating what it is, what all the actions and all the steps based on that objective and maybe sub objectives along the way. You kind of went completely the other direction without an objective, more or less, or with many objectives. I want to tribute to to David Bowie because I'm such a fan. He's passed away. I'm going to put a different song each day. Oh, someone else thinks it's a good idea to write about it. Okay, I'll write something about it. And it just kept changing and growing and morphing over time. All still sounds like tell me still without an objective.
I think that's fair. I think the process that you described a moment ago is how I approach work. And, I hadn't thought of it this way before, but I use a lot of the same, I would say, skills that I bring to work on this project. But you're right. And again, I've never thought about this before, but it's sort of a reverse process. The Bowie project, it's not just a blog anymore. So the Bowie project doesn't have an end goal. You're right. I have mini goals. So from week to week, if I'm preparing for an interview, there are things I want to get out of the interview. And I have, I would say short-term goals about topics that I want to cover, but there's no end point. And in terms of the blog, there are recurring topics. There are some features, like I do a weekly feature that's called Cover of the Week. But it's not to an end, right? There isn't an end in sight. And at some point, we're talking about passion. I get really excited about this. It's very exciting to me. I feel like I'm learning something every day. I feel like I'm creating something. I'm not an artist. I'm not a singer or a musician, but this is my creative outlet. And I get excited by that. And the way, I talk to a lot of musicians and I feel like it's not exactly the same, but the way they get excited about making music, that's what I'm experiencing in this project. But you're right. I mean, it's not with an end goal. It's the reverse of how I approach work. Yeah.
So let's use the analogy of musicians or artists of any kind, because I'd say often or largely people who do that, people who write songs, I write songs, at least I used to write songs. Now I write songs for my kids. I never wrote a song thinking I'm going to make this a hit. I'm going to get it on the radio. I'm going to right. You write the song for what it is. It's the creation of the art for the art. And then somewhere along the way, maybe you decide I'm going to give myself a chance. I'm going to see if people like this, or you get some feedback, and then maybe you arrive at gee, and people like my art. Maybe I should make money at it. Maybe I should, and even that will transform what you do because you can't, or it's very hard to divorce yourself from the objective once you've stated it. You've been doing this for many, many years now. You have this YouTube channel, with a weekly, I think you said, in terms of how frequently I mean, and I want to talk to you about how you plan it and what you do, but the thing that I can't escape from is, well, YouTube allows you to monetize your content, right? You could make money on advertising. How does that not enter your conscious and when you're thinking about, well, I do this thing, I don't really even know why I do it, it's just something I like to do?
There's a few different reasons that I'm not interested in trying to monetize it. The first is when going all the way back to when I started doing the YouTube interviews, I approached a friend of mine who is a former professional music journalist, and I said, her name's Julie, I said, I don't know what I'm doing. Please give me advice. She asked me questions similar to what you're asking me, but this was, as I was approaching maybe the second or third video interview that I ever did. And she said to me two things that have stuck with me. She said, you have two enormous advantages over a professional journalist. The first is that you're doing this purely because you want to. So you're not being assigned to go talk to some musician that you have no interest in. So that level of passion is something that serves you well, she said. And the second thing is you're not doing it for money. So that tells the person you want to interview that you really want to talk to that person. In my mind, at least, gives me a port of entry that if I was a small scale monetizer, content creator who was making a little bit of money, then I think what works into the equation, and I might be wrong, but I think what works into the equation is this guy big enough for me, right? Is this guy worth talking to? Whereas what I have found over and over and over again is musicians, Grammy winners, people who've played on, multiple Bowie albums. I'll mention names like Carlos Alomar played on more Bowie albums than anybody else. Mike Garson played with Bowie for a longer time than anybody else. Earl Slick, one of his longtime guitar players. Donnie McCaslin, who's very much, he just came out with the new album. He's appeared on my show twice. He was the band leader for Black Star, the last album. I could go on and on and on. There's an interview that I'm going to post that I did on location with the actress Sophia Ann Caruso. Hasn't posted yet, but I conducted it. She was one of the stars of Lazarus, which was the stage musical that came out 10 years ago. And she agreed to talk with me for its 10th anniversary. And she's literally a star of stage and screen. They seem to have all enjoyed talking with me. They all gave me like a long amount of time to talk with them. And I think in my mind, part of it is I am not doing this for a paycheck. I'm doing this purely out of interest. The other thing is I have a job, right? The state of New York pays me a good salary. Sure, I'm not a monk. It would be nice to have a couple extra $100, right? Very fortunate in that I don't need to make a little extra money. And it's beyond my ability to imagine that I could monetize this to the point that it would be a life-changing amount of money. If you have other ideas, then let me know, because if you but I'm not, making a few $100s off of this or even a few $1,000s. I'm privileged enough through, having worked in New York State government for a very long time that I don't, strictly speaking, need that money. Plus, it could cause some sort of conflict of interest that I just don't want to even think about. So for all those reasons, I'm not doing it for money. It costs me money.
Yes, you don't need the money, but well, people who come to me when they have a project that they want to protect, right? Maybe they are funding themselves, out of their pocket. Maybe usually they have a job or whatever if they're a small business or an entrepreneur, or they're committed already but they're so passionate about the thing they want to do that they want to turn it into something and they want to protect it, right? And I think about like angel investors and VC investors and all that world, they have plenty of money, and maybe you could say that their goal is to make more money. I'm sure that's true. Although I don't really understand that entirely, but largely I think what drives people like that is being a part of something that, making something bigger than it could have been, right? Getting it out to audience, etc. If you were doing this with an objective, a financial objective, or just a growth objective, the idea that you could get your interviews and your blog posts in front of so many more eyes and be an authority on David Bowie when things in the future come up and people want to talk about David Bowie in movies and news and other things because of who he was and his contribution. Like, why not have that goal?
So, two-part answer. The one is my professional career is in public service, and I don't have the private sector mentality of making money as the goal. but that being part of something larger or contributing to something larger absolutely drives me both in my professional life and in this project. Being part of something larger as it pertains to the Bowie project, one of the things I've discovered, which is I'm still amazed by, is that there is a Bowie community. There, in addition to fans who have their own networks, there are academic conferences on David Bowie. There are artists whose main subject is David Bowie. There are the Bowie alumni who, and I now, know many of them, meaning musicians who played with Bowie. Their subsequent careers post his life intersect with one another, and some of them go way off in directions that have nothing to do with Bowie, but they often come together and play. And sometimes, Donnie McCaslin, I mentioned, has the Black Star Symphony, where he performs with symphony orchestras in different cities around the country. This isn't his main thing. He's a jazz musician, but it's part of his career. I interviewed an artist named Jennifer Elster who did design work for Bowie for an album called Outside. And she mentioned to me something that stuck with me. She said, what you're doing is history. So the collection of interviews at some point will be used as a source for some other material. That I don't have an end goal in mind. I do feel that it's already become part of an ecosystem. I think David Bowie is going to be a figure that will be remembered and studied forever. I do think he's elevated to the point of cultural icon. And as we, I don't want to say that he will have the same impact as a Shakespeare, but I do think that, people 200 years from now will still be, maybe not everybody. He might not be as present as he is 10 years after his death, but I think he'll still be a figure who's studied. And I think a huge difference between how we study Shakespeare or how we study Mozart versus how we're going to study figures that come out of the 20th century is the degree to which we have recorded both them, their collaborators, commentary. If you think about it, we're talking in the year 2025. This is the year that movies that we might have seen turn 100, like Phantom of the Opera or the first Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? We might have seen those movies. I've seen those movies. They turned 100. When those movies were in the theater, nobody could see anything from 100 years earlier. The concept of 100 years ago was much more difficult to touch, right? So the concept of how generations from now will be studying the 20th century, the 21st century, and major artistic figures is going to be different just because there's going to be a lot more material. And in some way, I'm contributing to that. One other thing, and I'm sorry to go on so long, but there is something I do get out of it's a kind of compensation, which is I do want more. I don't particularly care how many people look at the blog, but I do care how many people look at the YouTube show. And the reason I do is I think the larger audience that gets, the more credibility I have asking the next person to come on the show. There was an actress who worked with Bowie who politely declined, and she implied the reason was I was too small scale, which was totally fine, especially when I asked her. I was really small scale. I'm still small scale. But, as I develop a larger bank of credible interviews, and as the audience grows larger, I think I can parlay that into getting more guests and guests that take into consideration how big is your audience.
Yeah, I think that comes into play, I think, for all of us in who are creating content. When I think about, guests ideally who I would like to have on my podcasts, although I don't really think about necessarily why, or they're just sort of, oh, this would be a really cool guest if I could ever get them, but I can't go ask them, right? Like, or I can ask them, but I don't know if they're going to say yes. I assume they're not. So I think that's a good point. I want to hark back, and then I want to go back even further, but I want to hark back to something you were saying about the way in which modern celebrities, modern icons are recorded compared to historically, because I think that was a really interesting point. And I kind of want to contrast it with, if you think about the times of Shakespeare, right? You have handfuls of information of documentary writings about him and of course his works. You could say that okay, in this era there's all this great content and that's going to be how the person will be remembered and that will be the repository. But there's also we're also at a time of sort of information overload because there's so much noise out there and there's so much inaccurate noise, even though you could chronicle aspects of someone's life and their contribution and their art, etc. You still have to somehow break from the fray of falsity or useless content, or how about AI generated content, right? That's gonna happen. In a sense, you're lost in the masses of information instead of just being the only one who has the information. And now there's a place to go for that.
Couple different things. The one is the practice of history, both academic but also popular, I think is evolving as information overload becomes more overwhelming. And, you mentioned AI. Who knows how AI is going to be used to cull information out of that vast expanse of gobbledygook and trash, right? And not in the distant future, but in the near future. When I'm doing an interview, especially when I'm doing an interview, the micro goal is to conduct the best interview that subject has ever participated in. That's where my personal arrogance kicks in. So I put a lot of thought into my questions. I do research to try to hear, some figures give more interviews than others. And I try to ask questions that are different or in a different way. I might have mentioned I recently interviewed the physicist Lawrence Krauss. If you want to see Lawrence Krauss, there's probably hundreds of videos on YouTube with him talking about the topic I talked to him about and about other topics as well. So part of my goal with that is not that I was going to get him to say something that he hadn't said before, but I wanted to have the discussion in a more compact format than I had heard before. It's one of my shortest interviews. It's about a half an hour. And, most of what I researched in approaching the interview with Lawrence Krauss is much longer than that. So I wanted him to explain complex topics in a concise and digestible way. And then I had the side goal of linking this somehow to David Bowie. And so that was my goal, right? So surely some of my interviews are better than others. Some will be lost to history and never be used as sources. Maybe none of them will be. But again, you go, to link the micro goal to the larger goal of being part of something larger. Yes, I am trying to provide either higher quality content as it is, or unique or different. I'll mention one other example. A very recent interview I conducted, it was with one of the United States' most prominent scholars on Tibetan Buddhism. And this was very directly linked to David Bowie, who had a deep interest in Tibetan Buddhism. He even considered becoming a Buddhist monk in the 60s, and makes several references to Buddhist concepts, and not just any old Buddhist concepts, but concepts that come out of Tibetan Buddhism in his songs. So we did a lyrical analysis of some of these songs. And think about that. I did a lyrical analysis of Bowie songs with one of the most recognized and respected academic experts in the field in the United States. And I've never encountered anything like that before. Any commentary on Bowie and Buddhism is not that. So I was really happy with how that turned out. In part, I thought it was a good interview, but also I thought that we created something that was unique. I thought we created something that just didn't exist. And believe it or not, there's other Bowie related shows. I do think what I'm doing is different than other Bowie related shows.
Yeah, I get that. As you know, like I'm in the field of intellectual property, and when people try to protect what they create, there's the element of the thing they create, and that's one kind of thing you can protect. The other kind of thing you can protect is the reputation associated with something, and ultimately, it feels like the world is gravitating more towards that. That is more important than necessarily sometimes the content. The content is the content, right? But being able to tie to the source, because of all of the noise out there and the approach, right? I do hear what you're saying. Like, I think being able to delve into a topic that probably was not really ever delved into with any real depth, or and doing with a different approach, um really adds value, and someone is going to be looking for that piece of information, and it will be the only source of that information, or one of the only sources, or at least the only one that has a particular perspective that people will need and will want. So I can see the value in that. I want to take the opportunity to use that commentary you were giving me about how you prepared for the show with Mr. Kraus, because I want to understand what goes into preparing for a show. Because look, you and I have a very sharp contrast between what we do, right? When I'm doing a podcast like this, it is off the cuff. I didn't script anything. We're just having a conversation. I'm thinking on the fly and writing some notes as we go. I know some things about you, but I haven't researched in depth to know. And watched all your YouTube episodes and read your blog to the level of depth that I could ask you deep questions about them, right? You, I think, do the opposite. So I want to understand a little bit about your plan, and how do you approach when you're going to do an episode on YouTube, or when you're going to write your blog?
Well, so I'll start with the YouTube show, and I will add the caveat. I had a guest this past summer who has her own music interview show. It has a much bigger audience. Her name's Sandy Kay. She's out of Australia, and she has an internationally syndicated radio show where she interviews musicians. So there was some similarity between what she was doing and what I'm doing, but it's not focused on David Bowie. I came across her show and I really admired her technique as an interviewer. So I invited her on my show. She gave me a piece of advice that I have taken and ran with, which I think has improved my interviews, which is she does not ask questions off of a script. So she does familiarize herself with her subject, but she has this very conversational style, and she does not sort of chain herself to a sequence of questions. So I have moved in that direction. She still does it better than me, but that's the kind of thing that I learned. But I do try to learn as much about who it is that I'm interviewing as possible. So with Lawrence Krauss, just for my own entertainment, I kept coming across him listening on different podcasts and YouTube shows that I was listening to, not for research for David Bowie. He speaks on a number of issues, including okay, so this is getting a little afield, but when I was in college, I was a double major, government and religious studies. Government's what I wanted to do. Religious studies, I just found the classes interesting and I kept taking them. And so I had enough to become a double major. And so still today, I will read books about religion and religious studies. I'm not religious myself, but I find the topic to be interesting. And, if you've ever looked at YouTube, you could find lectures or discussions or shows about anything. The thing enters your mind, you could find a show or a lecture about it, and it's on YouTube. So for fun, I sometimes listen to shows about religion or religious studies, and I particularly like debates between theists and atheists. And Lawrence Krauss was really at the center of what was called the New Atheist movement, that sort of was front and center a little more than 10 years ago. He's very close with a very prominent evolutionary biologist named Richard Dawkins. And in fact, the two of them were the subject of a movie called The Unbelievers. It was a documentary about them doing the sort of the circuit of these debates. I found myself listening to him, and his particular contribution to this debate was this based in physics and based in science concept that something can come from nothing, which is, in the debate about theism or atheism, it's a counter to the idea that something has to come from something else, right? And so the theists would say, because of that just the logic of that suggests a creator. The logic of that suggests a first cause. And so Lawrence Krauss comes along and provides a model that comes out of theoretical particle physics that at least raises the possibility that something could come from nothing. Fascinating to me. So I couldn't get enough of listening to Lawrence Krauss. And, this is months before I ever even reached out to him. I was doing a kind of research without knowing that I was doing research because I was listening to him. Right. And then I decided the cross pollination with the subject matter is going back to the very first interview that I did with Simon Critchley, the philosopher. He had drawn attention to the prominence of the word nothing in Bowie's lyrics. And ever since that time, this is a topic that came up over and over again in my interviews. I wrote about it in the blog over and over again. I contemplated why Bowie was using this word. Did he mean something by nothing? And at some point, I was like, that's the hook. I want to get this guy on my show, and I want to talk about nothing. Before I reached out to him, I bought his book, A Universe from Nothing, and I read it. So I wanted to have enough familiarity with his own. I had heard him talk about it. I wanted to read the book to have enough familiarity to have an intelligent conversation with a literally one of the most prominent particle physicists in the world, right? And I know very little about physics, let alone theoretical particle physics, quantum theory. This is not my area of expertise, but I wanted to be able to have an intelligent conversation with him about it. So I read the book. I then reached out to him. He replied right away. He was happy to do it. And there were still weeks between when he agreed and when I actually had him on my show. So that's when taking Sandy Kay's advice, I didn't come up with a script, but I did develop a strategy. Like I wrote out things that I wanted to touch on, and that sort of informed my conversation with him. And then the last piece was he told me that he had a finite amount of time. So I wanted to have the strategy around asking him these questions in a half an hour, which is shorter than my average video. But I think in this case actually turned out to be an enormous asset because it produced a video that's different. And all the podcasts I've heard him on, all the videos that I've seen, I haven't encountered him focused on this topic for that finite amount of time. Maybe it's out there. I haven't encountered it. That's how I approached that particular interview.
And how does that differ from when you've done other ones, or has it gravitated towards that with the advice you got from Sandy Kay and others, or do you kind of have now a ritual? This is how I'm going to do it. I've got a new guest. Here's what I'm going to go do.
No, it differs depending on why I'm interviewing the person. So if I'm interviewing a person who wrote a book, say about David Bowie, the most important thing that I need to do is read the book. If I'm interviewing a musician, I interview many musicians. I want to understand that musician's intersection with David Bowie, but I also want to have a better sense of what that musician did beyond David Bowie. I mentioned Donnie McCaslin. I listened to many of his other albums to get a better sense of the music that he makes. He worked with Bowie on one album, but Bowie has become part of his own legacy, and he's very much in the prime of his career. He's around 60 years old. He's going to be making music. It's very well received. It's very prominent within his genre, which is jazz, right? So I wanted to familiarize myself with what he did beyond Bowie. So I did a lot of listening. He didn't write a book, so I listened to a lot. I also, if there's a subject that has done many interviews, I like to listen to many of those interviews. And, I mentioned, another person I mentioned was Carlos Alomar, the guitarist, who gives many interviews. And I wanted to familiarize myself with his stories, with what he says. I want to try to come up with an angle that's different than, when you start listening to one person give multiple interviews, a lot of people ask him the same question over and over again. And I don't want to do that. And I'll mention somebody who I had a text exchange with. I don't mind mentioning this name. I have not done the interview with him. Tony Visconti, who was Bowie's longtime producer, not for everything that Bowie did. The David Bowie that we know of today, the art that he created, would be very different without Tony Visconti. Tony Visconti and I had a text exchange where he allowed for the possibility of doing a written interview, going back to that. And I would take it from Tony Visconti. Absolutely. But I haven't done it yet, in part because there's a guy that if I had the opportunity to ask Tony Visconti 10 questions, I want to make sure the questions I can't get the answer to somewhere else. His book, some other interview, something. And that's still working in my head, right? It might be weeks or months before I get to the point that I'm going to feel comfortable that my 10 questions are not 10 questions that he's answered before recent or in the near future. The last type, I mean, there's more than 3 types, but another type is sometimes I'll interview an up and coming musician that has some intersection with Bowie, for instance, covering a song, and there's much less to research. So I can do an interview knowing very little about the subject. I structure it in a different way, right? It's like I'm learning stuff just by asking, which is different than I think I have a sense of how this person might answer the question because I read the person's book. One of the first things I asked my friend Julie about was, if I'm interviewing an author about a book, how much do I ask them questions that they answered in the book in order to highlight the book versus how much do I ask them about something that they don't write about in the book? And she advised that I ask a mix. So I've taken that approach. So it's different from case to case, but some of these interviews are months in the making.
I appreciate the different approaches and the different reasons why you have to have different approaches. That makes a whole lot of sense. I'm thinking now, though, going back to objectives, right? I mean, you got into this because of your passion for the subject matter, and you have these mini objectives. Objectives along the lines of, how do I make sure I get the thing that other people wouldn't have gotten, right? Because my interview, how am I going to distinguish my interview from the 20 or so they did before, or from what they wrote in their book, or anything of that nature? That all makes a lot of sense for me. As I think about objectives sort of longer term, um, recognizing that, this has not been something you embarked upon with that sort of long-term objective. The long-term objective has been, let me get better and better, or more prominent people I could cover, who I could discuss things with. I can't help but thinking, at some point, you're still pretty young, but at some point you're going to retire. And I imagine the John out of government service is still doing the blog and the YouTube channel. And I'm wondering if this is something that you perceive as being sort of long term, and like, is this something you would want on your epitaph? Is this what you want to be known for? Is this your legacy?
Yeah, at this point, I don't think I have a choice in the matter. I think it will be. That's an interesting question. I, unlike most people, have a sense of when their professional career reaches an end, because I have a term that ends in February 2027. I'm already 56, and so to retire from the state of New York, you need to be 55 and 30 years of service in the state. I will have exceeded both by the time my term ends, and my expectation is to retire from state service. I'm not going to retire from civic engagement. I'm not going to sit there on the beach and do nothing. And so a question that I'm going to have to wrestle with at that time is, do I want to shift my engagement with public affairs and civic affairs, for instance, to become more vocal on political matters, which my current job frowns upon, versus do I want to take the Bowie project in a different direction, or do I want to expand it? Do I want to write a book? Do I want to, I don't know if this is a long-term goal or even a goal, but I would feel like I've accomplished something, and this is sort of a made-up fake accomplishment, if I got invited to present at a Bowie conference. That would be exciting to me. But is it a goal? No. I mean, the goal is this. I am having an enormous amount of fun. And as long as it's fun, I'm going to keep doing it. I'm learning stuff, right? I mean, we just talked about particle physics and Buddhism. These are not things that I knew much about before. And as long as I'm learning things and it's fun, I want to keep doing it and take it. I like to have the flexibility to be able to take it in different directions. And it's almost like a game to find the Bowie connection, right? So I mentioned a couple of examples, or on the blog, I have this feature called Drive-In Saturday, Tuesday Movie Review. So Drive-In Saturday is the name of a Bowie song. One of my other, lesser passions that I cannot explain is I love going to the drive-in. I'll see almost anything at the drive-in. So I do, when I am able to go to the drive-in, which is more frequent than you might imagine, I do I post on Tuesdays the drive-in Saturday Tuesday movie review, and I do a movie review, but I have part of it is the Bowie connection, and sometimes the Bowie connection is overt. There's a surprising number of movies that have a Bowie song in the soundtrack. Sometimes they're more tangential, and that finding that tangential connection is part of the fun. It's just fun. There's no goal. It's silly. It allows me to think in a way that is creative, that is different than the way that I'm thinking when I'm going to work. It's different than the way that I'm thinking when I'm trying to decide, what I'm going to eat for lunch. So it's pushing my brain in a direction that is engaging and enjoyable, and it keeps me thinking, and I think that's healthy. So I, look at what we just did. You were asking me about long-term plans, and I sort of veer back towards process rather than an end goal. And the truth is, there isn't an end goal. I'll probably reassess where I'm going with this in February 2027 when I file my retirement papers. But I don't know what that reassessment will yield. I don't know where I would take that project. That's the end of the answer to that question. But even in wrapping up that question, my mind is going in different directions. I'll see if you want to ask me anything that's relevant to that.
No, I'll let you go. You got the directions. You can keep going.
There's a level of guest that I'm interested in strategizing as to how to get on my show. There's also this concept of permanence, right? That's sort of been dancing around this whole discussion, right? So the idea that, my YouTube videos will exist in perpetuity, but will the YouTube channel exist in perpetuity? No. The blog, at some point, either when I'm alive or when I'm dead, I pay a fee to keep the page alive, right? So at some point, it will vanish. And I don't know. There's thousands of blog posts there. And some of my writing I'm very happy with. And I've done some writing that I think is good and different than what others have written. What do I do with that? Does it have any value beyond my personal entertainment? I don't know. But I do suspect that there will be a point where I'm going to think about how to convert like the best of what has come out of this project into something that is more enduring. And then the question is why? And the answer goes back to what I was sort of alluding to before. Do we know who the first violin was at the first time Mozart conducted his Requiem, right? Or who was Beethoven's favorite cello player? Do we even know that? Right? Do we know what their contribution was? And how much would our appreciation of what we will go to concerts to see today, how much of that would be enhanced by deeper understanding of what the composer himself was interfacing with, and how their contribution to the performance resonates to this day, right? Or going back to the example of the movies from the 1920s, you can draw a line between something like Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera and the Broadway play, right? That you might have seen, right? And if you didn't see it, tens of thousands of people have. So what is it that we're seeing? What's its origins? What's the larger context? And this sort of goes back to David Bowie. I did a piece for the blog that I haven't posted yet, but it's fresh in my mind. What ifs, right? So it was just a fun piece, counter historicals. What if David Bowie, during his glam period, came out with the exact same music, but he performed the songs wearing jeans and a t-shirt, had a crew cut, and no theatricality? I suspect that the songs would have the same value, and like the cool kids who are really into Leonard Cohen or the Walker Brothers would also be into David Bowie. but you and I wouldn't be having this conversation. And there's so, because I'm not a cool kid. You are. You would know about David Bowie, but I wouldn't. So, but there's so much about David Bowie's presentation that is contextual, right? That Ziggy Stardust is a concept album, right? And Black Star, that was another one of my what ifs. He wanted to do another album after Black Star. What if he did? We wouldn't think of Black Star as his goodbye. We wouldn't think of it as an artistic expression of the process of dying. If he had an album that came after that, right? So much of appreciating the art is appreciating the context, and context is even more important than the artist's intention. I don't know what he intended. I don't know why he chose a particular word. He's the worst. David Bowie is the worst source for interpreting David Bowie because he contradicts himself in interviews, right? And the one through line is he says some version of bring your own meaning to this. So understanding the context, I think for me personally helps me appreciate the art. If the end result of this process, if the end result of this project helps other people appreciate the art, I think that that's a kind of contribution to culture that parallels on a different scale, smaller scale than how I approach my professional life, which is, what I'm hoping to leave the world a better place. That's the mindset of a public servant, right? To help improve our community, to help improve humanity. I hope that my professional legacy is one that has advanced civilization. That's on a small scale, right? A little tiny scale. But I want to leave the world better than I found it, rather than worse than I found it. That's my professional motivation. But in that sense, I think that there's a parallel motivation that if I did start to try to calcify what do I ultimately want to do with this, it's that.
I think that is a great response and also a really good way for us to end our podcasts. But before we do, I do want you to remind folks about where they go and find your blog and your YouTube channel.
The blog is www.maggioreonbowie.com, Maggiore on Bowie.com, one word. Again, I have new content every single day on the blog. And the YouTube show, it's also called Maggiore on Bowie. The easiest thing to do to find it would just be to search for Maggiore on Bowie. And that has a new interview every week. Every once in a while, I add something extra in the middle of the week, but it's a new, guaranteed new interview every single week that has some connection to David Bowie, sometimes very direct, sometimes tangential. I try to make that always interesting.
Thanks very much. My guest has been John Maggiore, who has that amazing blog and YouTube channel on David Bowie in every different way you could possibly imagine. Really appreciate your being here, and catch you next time.